All right, for this next chapter, I need to explain to you a cycle or a pattern for your fighting that you might already be fairly familiar with. But in order to explain it well, I'm going to use a scenario that will help you to visualize and understand what happens a lot of times when couples get into fights. So just for a moment, I want you to use your imagination and just pretend with me for a little bit that somehow you found yourself stuck in the zombie apocalypse. Now, I know that sounds silly, but just bear with me for a little bit. Now, in this scenario, you're stuck in your part of town and there's no safe or easy way to get around the city. Now, for a while, you can survive with just what's around in your neighborhood, but the key thing is that you need to get access to fresh water and supplies. Now, the small reservoirs and ponds around nearby are maybe enough to help you survive, but over time, your water starts to run out, and now you're forced to do some things that you might not have done before. In order to get access to a fresh water supply and other things that you might need, you need to get to the other side of town. But the only way to do that is to get on the highway and use certain roads to get there. But here's the problem. Every time you get on this highway, the road conditions are so bad that you end up doing real damage to your car. There are abandoned cars everywhere, debris on the road, a bunch of zombies wandering around trying to eat your brains. There's just really no way to drive in this highway without risking serious damage to your car. Just a lot of bad stuff. Now, here's the kicker. To make matters worse, every time you've tried to drive this highway, you end up driving in circles, just looping around and around. For some reason, you can't seem to find the exit ramp to get you to over where you need to the other side of town. For some reason, that exit just seems to be hidden or blocked and you can't seem to get over. In the end, you wind up wasting precious gas trying to find your way to get to that life-saving water. So here's what happens. At first in the beginning, you decide, you know what, I'm good. No point in taking risks. It's better to not even try to drive this highway. All the damage and the waste just really isn't worth it. You think you can just find another way to make do with the water and the supplies that you've got already. It's just better and safer to not even try all that much. But months go by, years go by, and eventually you realize that you can't survive for much longer. And at some point, you're desperate enough to take the risk. So you get back on this highway, even though you know that it'll cost you and that there's a good chance that you end up going in circles and right back where you started. So now you're stuck between that proverbial rock and a hard place. Doing nothing isn't an option anymore. You know that you can't live like this for much longer. But then trying to drive this endless loop of a highway causes more harm and wastes whatever gas you have left in the tank. Sounds like quite a predicament, right? Okay, let's snap back to reality here. This little nightmare scenario of ours here is, of course, a parody of what fights can look like and feel like for a lot of couples. Maybe this describes you, except instead of searching for fresh water and supplies, you're searching for resolution and healing in your conflicts. And the highway that you're traveling on is fighting in your marriage, something that can and probably has done some serious damage to your marriage. Maybe at first you think you can get by without having to really do conflict. Maybe you can deal with it indirectly or find resolution that doesn't really involve having to get into serious fights. But as time goes on and you realize you can't survive, you cannot make it in your marriage without dealing with the issues. Your frustration and buildup of the unresolved issues forces you into an endless road that you know won't end well. The way you fight causes so much hurt that you really have to think twice about trying to get to that other side of resolution. But sooner or later, you're running out of patience for the fights that don't get resolved, and you're running out of gas in the tank to try to do much more as well. In the end, you're stuck, knowing that you need to resolve issues, but also knowing that every attempt to do that just ends up in more hurt and frustration. This chapter is about understanding this destructive conflict cycle that couples find themselves getting stuck in, and how to find that off-ramp to get to healing and resolution. In the last chapter, you learned about the structures for a conflict highway that's much safer, things like defining your tiers, your lanes for conflict. In this chapter, I'll start helping you to know how to find that exit ramp off of this bad loop of fighting and to make sure that you gain access to that highway that'll increase your chances of leading to resolution. And if you think about it, doing that is a lot like knowing your roads well enough to see when the right exit comes up and to make sure that you're actually making intentional decisions to go in a new and different way in your fights. Okay, let me give you an overview of what we'll cover in this chapter. This chapter is broken up into 3 sections. The first section that you're currently watching right now will introduce you to 2 different ways to plan for and prepare for your conflicts. And you can think of that like planning out your road trip before you actually get in the car and go on that road trip. The second section will start describing to you a different couple of cycles or loops that you can find yourself on in a fight. Just like how in the example that I just gave you describes these destructive loops, that section will help you to know how to take better command of where your conflicts go and what to expect. Then section 3 will talk you through how to divide and conquer your conflicts. Now, if you think of conflict, especially deep-seated and complex conflicts, as kind of like these long road trips that take a lot of time and effort to deal with, this last section will help you to break up that road trip into smaller and more manageable chunks. As we've noted before, most conflicts in marriage are usually quite layered and intertwined with other issues. So knowing how to separate things out and taking smaller bite-sized chunks out of your conflicts will help to go a long way toward getting resolution in the long run. Okay, let's start off with the first section by introducing you to two approaches to handling how you engage or start a fight with your spouse. One is called proactive conflicts and the other one is called reactive conflicts. In a nutshell, a proactive conflict is kind of like mapping out and planning a trip before you even get in the car. You plan out all the important details beforehand. Who's pitching? What's the issue? What's the lane? What's the tier? Ultimately, you're preparing a fight and defining what the outcome or destination is going to look like before you even get into it. Whereas a reactive conflict involves figuring out all those things on the fly. There's no preparation beforehand, but at a moment's notice, you're forced to decide which way you're going to go in a conflict, and you have to determine pretty quickly all those same things. Who's going to be pitching, what tier is it in, what lane. Either way, you have to define those three critical positions that we covered before. The only difference is how long you have to figure it out. Otherwise, if you don't, there's going to be a good chance that you'll find yourself stuck on that loop of bad fighting that we're trying to avoid. All right, let's start with proactive conflicts. And the reason why we're starting off with proactive conflicts is because they're the easier one. I mean, if you really think about it, if you plan a road trip ahead of time where you have time to really think and prepare, and you still end up getting stuck in that same old fighting loop, then chances are there's really not a high likelihood that you'll be able to navigate your way out of that loop when you don't have much time to prepare and plan. So we'll start with the easier approach of proactive conflicts. Make sure you can handle those kinds of conflicts better, and then lead into the more difficult reactive ones. Okay, so in simple terms, a proactive conflict just means planning and scheduling a fight with your spouse, which means that you're not waiting for a fight to get triggered, but rather you're thinking about issues that you know need to be addressed and initiating a conflict that's much more controlled and thought out. The upside here is that you get to prepare so that you can really go into that fight with a clear plan, which means that you're much more likely to get to a resolution that you're hoping for. The downside is that you have to be willing to rock the boat a little bit and initiate a fight when things might be going fine between you and your spouse. A lot of times, couples don't want to start something when things feel nice and calm. It's hard to bring up a conflict when it's easier to just keep things feeling like everything's okay. But ironically, that's actually the best time to have a conflict, when neither of you are flooded and that conflict window is much wider and longer to actually get to resolution and understanding. So let me challenge you right now to plan in advance one proactive conflict a week. Schedule time for you and your spouse to mentally and emotionally prepare to dig into a tier 3 conflict. If you schedule it and it's part of your routine, then you won't have to worry about the awkward initiating of a proactive conflict or worry about if it's going to be a good time for your spouse or not. If that time is scheduled for 10 a.m. every Sunday morning, for example, then you can just prepare yourself and assume that your spouse has prepared themselves as well. Let me also challenge you to actually write out and prepare your pitch ahead of time. Define what issue you want to talk about. Define who you want to pitch. Do you want to deliver something, or do you want your spouse to start off by pitching something so that you can find out more about what's going on with them? Define which lane that you're going to use and what resolution looks like and what you want to accomplish by the end of that conversation. Writing out all of this might feel awkward and unnatural, but it'll force you to really put thought into the issue and to plan beforehand. It'll also keep you accountable for staying on track and not getting lost or stuck in that bad fighting loop. Once you get better at communicating all the most important parts of your conflict, you can start communicating without scripting things out beforehand. So be sure to define those three key positions or the things that we covered in the last chapter. So who's pitching? What tiers are going to be in? We're assuming it's going to be tier 3 because it's a proactive conflict, but there are also times when you can plan for a tier 2 connection as well. And which lane are you going to be using, which in turn defines what the goal and the objectives are for that conversation. If you're planning on using the hurt lane to talk about areas of hurt and wounding in the marriage, make sure to write out and include your BTF, or the behavior, thought, and feeling, and any narratives that you might be able to connect as well. If you're using the alignment lane, be sure to pinpoint the value or the issue that you might feel like you're not on the same page with your spouse about. Remember, preparation is key here. You want to be concise, precise, insightful, and vulnerable as possible in whatever it is that you're trying to communicate and pitch. The better processed and planned out your delivery, the higher the chances that you'll have to elevate your conflict and to find resolution. Now, when it comes to proactive conflicts, it helps to think of it like going to the gym and working out. Going to the gym to exercise requires planning, discipline, and follow through. You don't just magically get stronger and in shape. You have to put in the work. So think of conflicts like going to the conflict gym once or twice a week. If you do the exercises regularly enough, guess what? When suddenly faced with a task that requires muscles and strength, you'll be much more prepared to do it because you were disciplined in planning and doing the workouts beforehand. Okay, let's move over to what reactive conflicts look like. Reactive conflicts are essentially the same as proactive conflicts, except you have a lot less time to put your thoughts together and to figure everything out. So in a moment's notice, in midstream of a number of other things that's going on for you, the moment you get triggered, you have to try to figure all those same things as quickly as possible. What's the issue? Who's the pitcher? What tier is it in? What lane is it in? Think of it like driving on a nice residential road in some calm neighborhood, and then all of a sudden you get thrusted onto a major highway filled with a lot of semis and speeding cars. You'll have to know how to identify these things quickly from a trigger in a conflict so that you can get to the right highway into resolution instead of getting stuck on that bad fighting loop. But the other thing that makes reactive conflicts so much harder than proactive ones is the flooding. Proactive conflicts happen when there isn't a trigger and that flood point isn't anywhere close. Reactive conflicts happen when there is a trigger and there's a real risk of already being flooded, which means if you're flooded, you can't think or see straight enough to decide on all those things really quickly. Think of it like being forced to drive in heavy traffic and to make key decisions when you're half asleep or heavily medicated. It's just a lot harder to do. But the reality here is life isn't always going to be about proactive conflicts. You can't always plan and prepare your fights. The majority of your fights are going to be reactive ones, and so you have to learn how to identify and use the structure quickly to handle reactive situations better. Remember, the more practice you put into proactive conflicts, get into that conflict gym, the easier and better you'll be at the reactive ones when they're forced upon you. The good news here though is that if you find yourself in a reactive situation and it goes bad and you get stuck on that bad fighting loop, then you can and need to use that emergency lane to call a timeout. And once you call a timeout, you can reset and process things more so you can figure out all those things that you need to about the conflict. Once you do that, you can pull out of that emergency lane and re-engage the conflict with a lot more clarity and preparation. So essentially, you can plan a proactive conflict coming out of a timeout from a reactive conflict that might not be going so well. Okay, so this section essentially introduced you to two ways to approaching and engaging a fight. Either way, whether it's a proactive fight or a reactive one, the idea here is to prepare you to make the best decisions possible so that you can set yourselves up for the highest chances of success. If you go into conflicts without any clear plan or any preparation, you can be almost certain that you'll end up stuck in that same destructive pattern and bad fighting loop in your marriage. All right, in the next section, we'll start looking into what these different paths or loops of conflict can look like so that you know what you're trying to achieve and what you're looking for.